So my key messages in this talk are that it's really crucial to think systematically about the choice of policy mechanisms to encourage practice change. I want to put a tool that some of you are already familiar with, I know, but some of you are not, the Public-Private Benefits Framework, and put that as a way of helping with that, one tool to help with that. And reinforce a message that's come up already a couple of times today, which is the need for it, where policy is using extension as its policy tool, to be sure that it's focusing on practices that are actually adoptable. But I'm going to start in a different place. So I'm an economist, and a hardcore message from a Treasury economist would be, or hardcore question would be, well, why worry? Why should governments even care about practice change? Why not just leave the whole thing up to farmers and their business advisors? And you can see a business advisor and a farmer kicking the dirt there in the paddock. And why can't they sort it out amongst themselves? And so the more soft-hearted, gentler economists amongst the profession would say because of market failure. And there's a whole host of potential reasons for market failure, and the ones that are particularly relevant to today's topic of practice change are externalities, which is what I refer to as the relative advantage of a practice diverging from the public benefits. And so there's a reason for government to step in and try and turn that around. Public goods, which lead to free rider problems. An example of that would be the weak incentives that the private sector has to invest in research practices that can be easily copied. You know, if you're providing information to a farmer that is helpful to them, they might be willing to pay you for it, but the neighbours can just copy the results. And so there's not the investor is not able to capture the benefits of their investment in research. And then information asymmetry, which is about the case where the government believes it has better knowledge of some aspect of the problem than the landholders do. So that's mainly relevant to new practices rather than to practices that are well established and about which farmers have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. It's unlikely that governments would have better knowledge about those practices unless something pretty unusual is happening. Okay, I want to talk about the choice of policy mechanisms, and present to you in a very abbreviated version of this public-private benefits framework. If you think this looks like it's something that might be useful to you, there's a larger amount of information about it on my website. Start with a couple of definitions. Private benefits, I'm talking about benefits and potentially costs that relate to the landholder who is making the decision about whether or not to change their practice. Then there's the public benefits, which is to everyone else. It's neighbours, downstream water users, city dwellers who care about biodiversity. It's anyone who's affected by the change in practice other than the person who's making the decision to make the change in practice. And this little framework simply identifies alternative projects or investments in practice change and attempts to identify the private and public net benefits of those changes and then plot them on this graph. So along the horizontal axis is the private net benefits, and on the vertical axis is the public net benefits. And the 0 point is current practice. So all of those dots are the performance of this new practice relative to current practice, a practice that it's going to replace. And there are dots all over the screen. There are some dots way over on the right-hand side, which are very good, very attractive to the landholder, and way over to the left, which are extremely unattractive. There are dots right at the top of the screen which have high public benefits, so maybe that's environmental benefits, and right down the bottom which are very bad for the environment, if the environment is the thing we're talking about for public benefits and costs. They're all over there. There's another example of forestry in a water resource catchment. This is an example where it's good for the landholder, it seems attractive to them, but it's bad for other people. And this would be an example where plantation is using up the surface water, which would have run off into a river and been available to downstream irrigators or to Adelaide or something. So the point is that the dots could be anywhere, and the question is, depending on where the dots are, what sort of policy mechanism would be appropriate? Incentives of some sort, extension, regulation, development of new technology, or informed inaction. If I worked you through the full set of rules, you'd get a table that looks, a graph that looks like that. And it falls out quite nicely. There's a reasonably nice demarcation of projects that qualify for, or for which particular policy mechanisms are appropriate. This is a very powerful little communication tool to get people starting to think in a systematic way about these issues. And it's quite interesting in presenting this to, say, a CMA board, which I've done quite a number of times now, that you can almost see the cogs turning when you put this graph up, and they're trying to relate it to what they're currently doing. Captured within that is a lot of the thinking that we've talked about today. And so, we've already, I think, seen presentations that reinforce some of these implications from that little graph. I think that it really highlights that the choice of policy tool depends on the individual situation. In this case, I don't mean necessarily the individual situation of a particular farmer. You can't target policies necessarily to individual farmers, although there are some that can, I guess. But more the situation in a region or for a particular industry. You need to think carefully about what policy tool is appropriate. A possibly surprising conclusion that people don't necessarily recognise is that the best projects are the ones that have private net benefits close to zero. I'll just go back and show you, and it is in relation to the positive incentives. The little wedge in the top there is the positive incentives section of the pie, and you can see that it's actually those projects that are pretty close to having a private net benefit of zero. Why is that? Well, it's the projects that are on the verge of being adopted, and so it's not that difficult to get them over the line. The level of incentive and the degree of pressure that you need to exert to make them be adopted isn't that great. So it's reasonably easy to understand. The other policy implication here is that relative advantage or adoptability or private net benefit, whatever you want to call it, is really a key to this thinking, and it's been a very neglected key. If you look at the way that policy programs have been developed, I don't think there's been any serious attempt to think through the adoption implications of programs in advance. A lot of worrying about it later, but not thinking it through in advance. So this is a slightly different attempt to come at something a little bit similar. It's another way of unpacking that set of issues. And this is a way of highlighting the importance of adoptability. So in this little framework, I asked the question, is the innovation adoptable? Yes or no? Now, of course, there's shades of grey, but to keep it simple, let's go with yes or no. So if it's not being adopted because it's new, then maybe the adoption will occur at some future time, and the appropriate sort of policy response or extension response in this case is simply to promote awareness. Maybe that's all you need to do. Or is the reason it's not being adopted a learning failure? So this is what Rick Llewellyn was talking about earlier on, where there are practices out there that are well known, but he was able to identify some very specific parts or aspects of those practices about which farmers had quite bad misconceptions, and to target the extension activities very closely onto those. Or is it lack of skills or lack of resources? So in that case, you may be more about a training type program, or it may be as simple as waiting for a good year, and so that the year after the good year, people can adopt. What if you look at the innovation and evaluate it critically, perhaps using the approach that Jeff Kane presented to us, and you've decided it's probably not sufficiently adoptable. Maybe there's only 5 or 10% of farmers would be willing to adopt it, but you've decided that for your environmental purposes you need 50, or 80 was mentioned earlier on. What do you do then? Well, one option is to develop a better technology, one that is adoptable. So that's the strategy of the Future Farm Industry CRC, who identified that for the sorts of issues they're dealing with, the practices just aren't out there, and their job is to go away and try and create some new ones that are adoptable and are sustainable. Or you could look at, well, are there public benefits to justify some financial payments or a regulatory approach? Or is the best response simply no action? Maybe we're better off, maybe it's so intractable or the practices are so unattractive that it's simply better to put your effort into other issues. So I'll finish with a repetition of my key messages, that we do need to think systematically about the choice of policy mechanisms for practice change, that I've given you a couple of tools that might be helpful to do that, and that we need to think in a more sophisticated way about the ways that we target extension into particular practices. Thank you very much.